Hi, this is Ingrid from the Institute of Politics, and I am here with the former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd. Mr. Rudd is currently a senior fellow at Harvard University's JFK School of Government, as well as a visiting fellow at the IOP, working at the Belfer Center of Science and International Affairs. At the Belfer Center this semester, Mr. Rudd has led a major research effort on the possibilities of a new strategic relationship between China and the United States. We are here to speak about the impact of Mr. Rudd's research, as well as the Prime Minister's experience at the Belfer Center and the IOP. So having led this research effort over this entire semester, could you tell us a little bit about how you and your team's research has impacted your opinion on China's relationship with the United States, as well as China's role as a global leader?
Well, the great thing about Harvard is there's a bunch of bright people here. And when it comes to US-China relations, we're blessed in this university by having people who are serious scholars in Chinese history, serious scholars in Chinese philosophy, serious scholars in the Chinese economy, as well as those who focus on China's formal engagement with the rest of the world. Where I've sought to add some value, to the extent that I can, is how do we bring these various streams of China expertise together in an integrated analysis which looks at the future of China-US relations. So where I have sought to add value, to the extent that I can, is in how do we integrate these various strands of extraordinary specialist knowledge about China into an approach which aims exclusively at the future. Can we construct a new strategic relationship between China and the United States? One which is sufficiently mindful of the interests and values of these two countries? If so, what does it look like? How do we conceptualize it? How could you operationalize it? And finally, what does that mean for the rest of us who don't happen to be Americans and don't happen to be Chinese? What does it mean for the future of the regional rules-based order in Asia? What does it mean for the future of the global rules-based order? So these are large questions, but because of China's rise, and it's so significant, they are now increasingly urgent questions for policymakers and policy advisors to address. So that's why I'm here, and I'm learning from all these folks across the university in areas where I thought I might have known a fair bit, but I've discovered there's a lot more to learn.
So I'm aware that you've had a career with China that spanned over 30 years. You've both lived and worked in China, and you're a fluent speaker in Mandarin Chinese. Through your experience with China, in your opinion, what are the areas that China should improve upon in order to become a substantial global leader?
Well, the principal advantage of having lived in a country for a while is that you develop a feel for the country. And I've lived in China for a number of years. And that was way back in the 80s. But what the advantage of that is that you actually can measure, feel and see the changes over the last 30 years. It's about 30 years this year since I first arrived in China. And so it gives you a great benchmark for understanding the pace and direction of change. It also, in the period of 30 years, you accumulate many, many friendships with Chinese people who in the course of that period of time will provide their reflections on what they feel about their own country's future, what they understand to be the policy direction of the leadership in China, and what they are concerned about in terms of the challenges that they face. So the virtue of having lived there, liking the country, having many friends there, speaking the language, is it provides analysts with a continuing reality check as to what might be theorised about in a classroom here in Cambridge as to what actually is happening in the villages of southern Henan.
And what is your opinion about the situation between Russia and Ukraine right now and the possible implications that this could have on the relationship between China and the United States?
Well, the current state of global great power relations is under serious strain. We've been discussing primarily the relationship between the world's only continuing superpower, and that is the United States of America, and the world's emerging great power, China. But of course, Russia, previously the Soviet Union, was a superpower, remains a great power, not simply because of the size of the country, but also because of its extraordinary array of weapons of mass destruction available to it. So this is a very complex and dynamic period in great power relations of the type we haven't seen probably since the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s. Looking to the future, I have learnt enough about international relations and politics to know this. There are things that you know and there are things that you definitely do not know. And whereas I've specialised in China for 30 or 35 years, I've not specialised in Russia. But I think there are a couple of relevant questions to ask. Number one is this. The strategic rationale for the normalisation of China's relationship with the United States in the 1970s occurred for one principal reason, and that's because of common concerns both in Beijing and Washington about the continued rise of the Soviet Union. And so that formed the strategic rationale which underpinned Nixon's visits to China, Kissinger's visits to China, and the normalisation of relations during the course of the 1970s. Of course, the second point for us to ponder is this. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, in many respects, what also collapsed was that underpinning strategic rationale which existed for the previous 20 years. And many assumed that therefore with the Soviet Union out of the road, peace, enlightenment and global brotherhood would simply automatically manifest itself. Regrettably, history sometimes teaches us that doesn't necessarily follow. And so I think what we've seen the last 20 years or so is an attempt both by the Chinese and the Americans to reconstitute a new strategic rationale for their relationship into the future. But this is a vastly complicated exercise. One, because the United States and China are enjoying cooperation in so many domains where they both need each other acutely, not least of all in the economy as future drivers of global economic growth, but also need to cooperate with each other in areas like climate change, because they are both the largest greenhouse gas emitters in the world. But at the same time, with a high degree of strategic competition between the two of them as well. And so what I have sensed in the last 20 years or so is a slow process of strategic drift from the close collaboration between China and the United States back then and what has occurred in the period since '91, which brings us to the present. And almost 20 years on again, we see a major deterioration in Russia's relationship with the United States and the collective West. We see China in a position whereby it has not automatically followed Russian policy in the UN Security Council. It abstained on the resolution recently condemning Russia rather than voting with Russia. And at the same time, China has a deep interest in a long-term strategic relationship with Moscow, not least because they see that as offsetting the unipolarity of the United States in the future global order. So these are all new factors which have emerged. Of course, the key question is this. What does Moscow think in the future? It best guarantees its interests and its values vis-a-vis Beijing and vis-a-vis Washington. How does Beijing view that reality against Moscow and Washington, noting that President Putin will soon visit China? And of course, how does Washington view this? If we're going to simply, however, play the game of rolling balances of power, one against the other, my only cautionary tale from history is that didn't work terribly well and lead up to World War I. Therefore, my argument is this. It's far better for China and the United States, at least, to begin developing between them a common culture of developing new global rules for the road in areas of common policy interest for the future between them, whether it's in cybersecurity, whether it's in new forms of economic cooperation, whether it's environmental cooperation on climate change, or whether it's in new forms of regional security mechanisms in Asia. So you've raised an important, critical and complex question. And you can either simply say the world is retreating into its own nationalist boxes, and that's dangerous, Or you can prescribe other alternative ways of organising international relations of the type I've at least suggested between China and the United States.
And you yourself, being a native of Australia, how did you become so interested in China?
Well, I grew up on a farm in rural Australia, and my mother, a very wise lady, quickly deduced that I was not cut out for farm life, and not least because I had not the slightest interest in farming. And so she used to feed me books, and so I'd jump on a horse and ride to different parts of the property and then just quietly read under a tree. And some of those books were about China. And so my mother, neither of my parents had ever been to high school, let alone to university, but my mother deeply understood the importance of education, and she, as a woman into the early 70s, 1970s, was acutely conscious of the importance of China's rise. She used to feed me newspaper articles. When China joined the United Nations, for example, replacing Taiwan in 71, 72, I remember being fed these newspaper articles saying, you should read this is very important. And so most young men, if they're courageous enough, will admit that their mothers have a profound influence on them. And so mine certainly did on me. But then I went to university, learnt Chinese, studied 5 years of Chinese language at the Australian National University in Canberra, 5 years of Chinese history. That's the beginning of my own China odyssey. But the great thing about China is this: the more you think you know, in fact, you become conscious of all that you still do not know. And having been analysing China now for 35 years, there is still much more to understand.
So tell me about some highlights that you've experienced as a visiting fellow at the IOP, and what are some of your biggest takeaways from the IOP?
Well, the first big highlight for me at the IOP was none of the kids went to sleep. That's always a good start. And two, they laughed at my jokes, which, I mean, you're already sort of in a positive zone. Seriously, these are a bright bunch of kids. They're passionate about a future in public policy, and some of them in politics. They're passionate about why you would get into public life, the values which drive you, the things that you think you can do, the personal qualities which are necessary to negotiate public life, which means personal resilience, and then thirdly, broad directions in which they may go. But in terms of the kids themselves, it's simply the searching nature of the questions I receive from so many of them about values and the impact of underlying values on policy, whether it's domestic policy, on the economy, or on foreign policy, or the rest. I was pretty impressed by these young folk, half from America, half from around the world. With your generation in charge, I'm feeling reasonably comfortable about the future.
And moving forward, what exactly are your future plans, and how do they involve China?
Well, I'm in China about every 6 weeks or so, and not least because I have a daughter who lives there and a son-in-law who lives there who's a Chinese Australian, and a beautiful little granddaughter who's about 23 months old, who has completely stolen my heart. And so, I go to China, I see my family, but at the same time I go and see most of the think tanks and many of the ministries in the Chinese government, and I will speak at conferences and continue to refine the ideas that I'm developing through my Harvard research project about, is a new strategic relationship possible? How do we conceptualize it? How do we operationalize it? Or is it all an illusion? Is it all just too hard? I'm an optimist. I think we can negotiate a way through, but we won't negotiate our way through based on luck. We won't negotiate our way through on the basis of coming up with a good idea at 5 minutes to midnight. We'll negotiate our way through if we think the problem through carefully, devise common solutions to common problems, and in a manner which is capable of being explained to the different constituencies which exist both within China and the United States.